In the last quarter of the 19th century, industrial capitalism spawned a new race for empire. For most of the century, through the 1870s, old European empires established much earlier in the quote, New World declined or disappeared. Revolutions had divested Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain of most or all of their colonies in the Americas. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, industrial nations faced global economic depressions. The first occurred in the 1870s, and a second, even more severe depression in the 1890s. Business leaders blamed overproduction for these economic convulsions. Industrial capitalism had produced a glut of goods that simply could not be absorbed in established markets. Finding new consumers in the world's untapped markets, manufacturers believed, would solve the problem. Colonies also bestowed prestige on imperial powers as well as access to raw materials. Africa, Asia, and the islands of the Pacific were the most sought-after prizes in the competition for colonies. Racialist theories propped up by new, allegedly scientific claims of white intellectual and moral superiority over darker-skinned peoples provided ideological justification for colonization. Colonists also presented themselves as aiding and, quote, uplifting the uncivilized. Missionaries intent in spreading the Christian gospel abroad often laid the groundwork for expansion, and businessmen and political leaders soon followed in their footsteps. The U.S., unlike European powers, did not have a long tradition of empire building. After all, the nation had been established by repudiating Great Britain's colonial claims. In the 19th century, the political extension of the United States beyond its continental boundaries represented a new departure. But in many ways, colonization abroad continued the federal government's policies of westward expansion within the continental U.S. and its conquest of indigenous peoples. Even as many Americans remained uneasy about the nation's scramble for empire abroad, a combination of crises in the 1890s, economic, social, political, and cultural, thrust the nation into the global scramble for empire. Creating new consumers did not necessarily lead to colonization. The world's strongest industrial powers, particularly Great Britain and the U.S., generally preferred open-door policies. In other words, they asked only for unhindered access to markets where, they confidently believed, they could compete successfully against economic rivals. But weaker industrial nations preferred the security of colonies. Once nations began to stake colonial claims in less developed parts of the world, international rivalries soon pushed all industrial nations into a scramble for empire. By 1899, even the U.S., which had pursued a commercial empire with great success, followed its European rivals in creating formal colonies. The untapped markets of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, as well as their natural resources, loomed large in the eyes of expansionists. Factories required rubber, vegetable oils, and minerals such as copper. Beginning in the 1870s and accelerating in the 1880s, European powers ruthlessly carved up most of Africa into colonies. In 1884 to 1885, they met in Berlin without the presence of a single African nation, primarily to deal with rival claims in the Congo and Niger basins, but ultimately to divide much of the continent among themselves. Their actions set off decades of bloody wars to gain control of territories on the continent. Although not seeking land, U.S. representatives succeeded in getting a pledge from European powers to an open door to market goods in the Belgian Congo. Asia was just as alluring as Africa to imperialists. European powers partitioned Southeast Asia as they had Africa in the 1880s, with France acquiring Indochina and Britain annexing Burma. China, a weak nation at the time with 300 million people and potential consumers, would be the site of numerous conflicts among the rival world powers. European powers and Japan, quote, carved the Chinese melon into territorial slices of domination as the U.S. demanded fair access to the China market. In the 1880s and 1890s, many Pacific islands were annexed. The U.S. annexed Hawaii in 1898 and claimed the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as colonies the same year. Between 1876 and 1915, the world's powers, imposing colonialism around the globe, claimed roughly 25% of the world's lands and peoples. Treatment of Indians provided important precedents for empire building. Not only did the U.S. acquire by force lands that had belonged to Indians, it also rejected the right of native peoples to rule themselves and impose direct rule on them. In addition, the Supreme Court ruled in 1884 that Indians born of reservations were not citizens but instead nationals who owed allegiance to the U.S. but had none of the privileges of citizenship, a status that lasted until 1924. These legal concepts were later applied to colonized peoples in both Puerto Rico until 1917 and the Philippines.